I'd like to now invite Dr. Baker to discuss the REL report that has just been released.
Well, hello, everyone. So just kind of springboarding off of what's been shared from Rick Kallenberg and from Harrison. This is our first kind of proof of concept analysis on actually using data for multiple years across higher education institutions to figure out what are the costs associated with achieving some common set of outcome goals that we might measure in a higher ed context, and how might we use that information then to drive funding either through a K-12 style need and cost adjusted formula, or how might we use need and cost adjustments to adjust an outcomes oriented formula, because either way we're talking about trying to get students to certain outcome goals and the different costs for different students in different contexts of getting to those outcome goals. And our premise here is that if we get enough data on the students, the outcomes they achieve, the institutions they attend, we can estimate models that will help inform policy around who costs more than other students to achieve these goals and how much. So the idea is that rigorous analyses built on as much data as we can gather, relevant data, are needed to determine whether the system as it exists is equitable and based on different costs, and how we might then inform the design and redesign of a system that could be more equitable. That's the motivation here. Can we draw on data and modeling techniques that have been used fairly extensively in K-12 education to estimate the costs of achieving certain kind of outcomes on state standardized assessments and graduation rates? Can we look at the types of outcomes measured in a higher ed context? Can we gather the data and build models that will help us understand the costs to achieve those outcomes? Next slide, please. So we do this in three parts. We ultimately want to get to that model of costs to achieve these common outcomes, and how much more and less it costs here and there and with these students and those students. But we actually start, and this was particularly important in our moving into higher ed, and we talked extensively about this, Jesse and I, extensively about this in the chapter that we wrote for the book with Rick Kallenberg and Century. We have to figure out, well, what are the different measures of characteristics of student populations that do in fact present risk of not achieving the desired outcomes, not achieving the success points or target outcomes built into the system, or other important outcomes. We got to figure out, well, what are the risk factors? What are the different characteristics of the student population that might increase the likelihood they don't achieve those outcomes and might affect the costs that it takes to give those students equal opportunity? So step one is figuring out what are the factors that are associated with the outcomes, what are the characteristics of the students, and what are the best measures we can capture from which sources are available. The next question is to look at, well, there's the existing spending across community colleges and how that varies. Does it vary logically with respect to the factors we would expect it to vary with respect to? So number two here is the what is. How does spending currently vary? Does it vary with respect to the things that we think it should vary with respect to, or does it vary in other ways? So we go from risk analysis to spending analysis, or the what is. And then we move into the cost analysis in looking at what levels of additional funding might be needed to achieve some common set of outcome goals for students from different backgrounds and in different settings. Then we're able to kind of use that as a basis for evaluating how well aligned is the current system, the what is, with a system that would be cost and need based, the what should be. So we take some look at the alignment between the what is and the what should be. So to kind of recap on the next slide. Next slide. We've got this kind of risk or needs analysis. What are the need factors? And they really go into two different buckets. One is this bucket of student characteristics that affect the likelihood that there are greater needs to get to common outcome goals. We've already heard reference to some of them: students who are academically disadvantaged, economically disadvantaged, first generation students, students who are in this case, the cut point ended up being greater than 24 years of age. So students who are older and non-traditional students progressing through the system. So we identified the need factors, we do some equity analyses, and then we ultimately reach this point of developing out an education cost function model where we estimate the additional costs associated with different student characteristics in different contexts to achieve some common set of outcome goals, the picture for which is on the next slide. Oh, yeah, here we go. Yeah, so in an education cost model, we are basically looking at how much do these institutions currently spend. It's at the middle of the picture here. And spending is really the combination of the cost of doing something plus any additional inefficiencies that might exist in the expenditures. But how much do these institutions spend, given the students they serve, given the context they're in? Are they a small, remote institution? Are they an institution in a higher cost labor market where their faculty costs are going to be higher because of the competing wages they have to pay for them? That's the resource prices piece. To get student needs, resource prices, and other structural geographic figures like being small and remote. We've already heard reference from Harrison to this idea that small remote institutions might operate at a higher unit cost to produce outcomes simply because they lack economies of scale. Important in this model is that we also specify some outcomes, that we have some measures that we want these students to achieve. In this particular proof of concept analysis that we've done for Texas, we have built student outcome measures on the success points model, on some of those progress to completion type measures that are built into the success point system, to look at the average success points achieved by the typical student at each institution. So our outcomes are driven by the success points types of measures, but in other settings we've used very related measures of persistence and completion, because the goal here, either way, is to get students to, at equitable rates, complete these programs, degrees, and certificates that move them into higher income positions or onto 4-year credentials beyond their 2-year credential. So we can go to the next slide here. We drew data from a variety of sources. One of the things that's always wonderful about working with the state of Texas is access to the breadth and depth of data that are available through the Texas public agencies, and the Higher Ed Coordinating Board was instrumental in providing us data with high levels of consistency and precision on student outcomes that we could use for constructing these success point based outcome measures and student need characteristics and enrollments. We did bring in other data from the College Scorecard, which is a national data collection that had a measure of student income, of students' family income level that ended up working in our model. And that's always one of the tricks here, is finding the measures that work best in the model. We relied and have relied in many other similar studies on the Integrated Post-Secondary Education Data System, IPEDS, has a wealth of data on all kind of higher ed institutions in the US, and had fairly complete data and consistent data on Texas community colleges. And another data set that we relied on, because it provides information on the public K-12 school districts that serve as the backdrop, the pipelines from which students come to go into these community college systems. We use the School Finance Indicators database, which is something that I'm a co-creator of, that is housed through the Albert Shanker Institute. It's also just at schoolfinancedata.org. And it gives us a whole lot of information about the county level economics and demographics, and the county level economics and demographics in particular of these student populations in the K-12 school districts that might then be going on to attend these community colleges. So that those data, partly because they're already compiled for multiple years, those data were also used in this study to build out these models. From here, let's move into some of what we found, which is next up. So first, again, that first step is figuring out, well, what are the different characteristics of students and contexts that predict that have a relationship to the outcome measures, to the student, this kind of average success points completed by the typical student. Well, in institutions where, so there are negative relationships that were found between the percent of first-gen students and the outcome measure, the percent of students at an institution who are academically disadvantaged and the outcome measure, and the percent of students who are older than 24 years of age and the outcome measure. Each of those factors, along with English learner students and being in a medium-sized college, each of those factors were associated with having a lower average number of success points completed per the typical student. So, and it makes sense that what we have here are, again, institutions serving more first-gen students and academically disadvantaged students and older students are having, on average, lower outcomes. And again, the premise here of identifying these risk factors is that we might want to then identify the funding leverage that is needed to mitigate those risks. So let's move to our next slide. When we look at the way funding is currently associated with different factors, we see that it's not necessarily, in some cases, we do see equitable distribution, but in other cases we don't, in that we see negative relationships between existing spending and the percent who are academically disadvantaged. If the system were designed to leverage resources to offset the disadvantage of being academically disadvantaged, we'd likely see that going the other direction, that there'd be more money available where more students are academically disadvantaged. But here we see that there's less funding available with increased academic disadvantage, and where there are more students who are dual credit. But yeah, there's some mixed news here. We have positive relationships between existing spending and first-gen students and older students and English learners. So the equity picture is a little bit of a mixed bag, but by seeing it as a mixed bag, that tells us that it's not really systematically need-based. When we look at the existing current expenditures across these institutions, they are positively related to some need factors, but negatively related to others. And they're not really related in the right amounts to offset disadvantage, really in any of those cases, but it's not all negative. It's a mixed bag. But that also makes sense because it's not been driven by a rigorous empirical model. So from there, and we can go quickly to the next slide, and I'll kind of bounce over this. This is what I was kind of suggesting before, is that the relationships between spending and needs can be progressive or regressive or neutral. When they are in the right direction, that there's more money going where there is greater need, that's progressive. Where there's less money going where there's greater need, that's regressive. And again, what we saw was some things go in the right direction, some things not go in the right direction. But given that the system has not been built on an empirical analysis that tells what direction things should go in, and on the basis of what measures, that makes sense. That brings us to a model that is intended to tell us what direction things should go and how much. So when we estimate that cost model, we are then able to use that model that has all those different measures in it, and the spending and the outcomes and the student characteristics and context. We're able to use that model to come up with a predicted cost, first off, of kind of like the minimum need student in the minimum need context. And what we have there is that the cost of achieving statewide average outcomes. And this, Rick, in his presentation a little while back, spoke to this issue of adequate outcomes. We are just setting the bar in our analysis here at what's the cost of achieving the existing statewide average. We are not implying one way or the other that that is adequate or not, but just as a setup here, if we did decide what the adequate outcome was, what number of success points, what rate of completion and persistence we really wanted out of all of our institutions, we could set that as the bar in place of just the average. Here, the cost of achieving the statewide average for a student with no additional needs in a large size community college would only be about a little over $4,500. So if you had an institution that was just all lowest needs students and ran at efficient scale, you'd have a pretty low per pupil per student cost to get the statewide average outcomes. Of course, that's not a condition that really exists anywhere. So let's get a little more to reality here. To provide equal opportunity to achieve those statewide average outcomes, students who are 24 years older than 24 years and first gen cost more than double that estimated base. And most institutions have at least some, if not many, of those students. Students from low-income households, English learner students, and students attending smaller, medium-sized colleges cost another 18 to 31% more. And again, many of these institutions are of that size and have students of those characteristics. So this is what brings us more toward the average that's currently spent and the differences in need. Students participating in dual credit. When you have more students in dual credit, the costs are lower, in part because those costs have just been pushed on to other institutions in some ways. So the example at the bottom, I think, is useful, and that is it would cost 3.19 times the base per student cost for a first-gen college student with no additional need factors who attends a small college to have the same opportunity to earn success points milestones as that minimum need student in a large college. For this first-gen student with no additional needs at a small college, the cost is $14,460. So it multiplies pretty quickly, and every institution across the state has some degrees of additional needs. When we look, just a couple of kind of analyses then, given what we found, the first quintile here, the first colleges with larger differences in projected adequate costs and actual spending have bigger outcome deficits. What we're saying here is that the first quintile are the districts, the colleges with the smallest gaps, and may in fact be spending more than what was estimated to just achieve the average outcomes. And the quintile 5 are the institutions that are least well-funded. The least well-funded institutions have lower outcomes, as opposed to the most well-funded institutions, which have higher outcomes. The next one may be a little clearer if we, instead of sorting them by their outcome gaps, sort them by the share of first-gen students as one of the need factors. The green bars are the projected cost to get to adequate outcomes. And you can see that the green bars kind of go up incrementally as you increase the share of students who are first generation. Okay. On average, higher cost to achieve average outcomes with more first-gen students. And that's what's seen in the green bars. But if you look at the grayish bars, not sure how this is translating to those out there, the grayish bars, though, you can see that the highest need, the institutions with the largest shares of first-gen students do not have systematically more funding. They actually have slightly less existing spending, and their gaps then between existing spending and need are bigger. There's a 14% gap for the institutions with the largest shares of first-gen students compared to only a 4% gap for the institutions with the smallest shares of first-gen students. These are not huge gaps compared to what we see in a lot of K-12 analyses, but they are there and they are systematic and they're significant. And they can be corrected with kind of rebalancing, readjusting the formula for needs. So we can move on to the next slide. So again, on the analysis of existing spending, we found a bit of a mixed bag, that the current funding system is progressive in some respects and not so much in others. However, the additional amount of spending for students with any of these characteristics may not be enough. But then we went and estimated that cost model, which told us how much would be needed in different circumstances for different students. And we're able to line up the existing funding against the what is, against the what should be, to be used as a basis for adjusting, either directly adjusting the funding or adjusting the funding driven through the success points model to give greater, kind of more equity in the ability of these institutions to generate, to achieve success with the students they serve. We do, in this particular report, have an accompanying, if we jump to the next slide, we have an accompanying simulation tool, a downloadable spreadsheet simulation that allows the user to test a number of different kind of alternative scenarios, either using the weights that came directly from our empirical analysis or testing alternative weights to see how that affects the amount of funding that would go to each individual kind of Texas community college. There are certainly opportunities to do more with, actually, if we go to the next slide, we've got the interface, which shows, these, what's in here now are the weights that were derived directly from the cost model we estimated for how they affect the cost to achieve common outcome goals. And those have little adjusters. Now, again, what we would suggest is that the best model is that which is actually based on the cost estimates. But one of the things you can do in this kind of interface is say, well, what if we wanted to get to that target within 3 years? We could incrementally adjust it for a couple of years, in between, to see, what do the interim changes look like as we move toward those weights. The next picture is, if we jump to the next slide, is the kind of output that we see. And I used the word earlier, this issue of alignment, in that the existing spending variation is not aligned with what would be the predicted cost variation. We're able to look at, for example, the dots here, the blue dots are each dot's a community college, and their position here is that their actual per student spending, and the line, the diagonal represents the what should be, and can we generate greater alignment? We provide this kind of output in the simulation model. Let's jump to the next slide. So these are just some of the kinds of tools that are there to figure out how do we bend this system by tweaking these weights that are driven into the community college funding model, either directly or through the success points. How do we bend it toward equal opportunity, knowing that it's not going to be an instant and exact thing, that we all of a sudden implement the best possible model and there's all of a sudden equal opportunity. And that's always been my thought behind, how can this type of empirical evidence and how can these simulations influence policymakers' decisions on kind of providing a more equitable and adequate funding model. And this is really our first kind of solid proof of concept piece in using this in a community college system. So I will kind of jump from there, leave it at that, and take it to the panel discussion. I think I've probably gone way over, but because I went a little off the cuff there, but let's kick it into some conversation.
Thank you so much, Bruce. That's a lot of information in a small amount of time, but the report is out there, and I suggest everybody take a look at it, and you'll find a lot more detail that Bruce could not get into.